Hello and welcome to another video in the series where I take a look at how I built sort of previous games, looking at some of the technical aspects in particular, also talking about some of the design aspects. So this time around, I'm going to be taking a look at a game called Let Me Tell You a Story. So the premise of this is that you are in a taxi ride essentially, and you have this sort of story unfolding where the driver is talking to you and you can choose to respond in different ways or not respond at all. And different stories will sort of unfold each actual time. So there's, I think, 6 or 7, 5, can't remember exactly how many I wrote for this. And it's a procedurally generated environment as well. So it's something where I want to take a look at how I actually did that and how I have all of the movement and everything happening. So let's dive on in. So this is the game. So I'm here in the car and we can see it move around. If I start back up from the beginning, we can see there's no environment around me. But if I run it, then I can actually look around and the environment is all, so we've got these, I wanted to be at night, and I particularly for the visuals, like with it at night, I wanted to have windows that had, this real sort of bright glow and intensity to them. So I wanted this real sort of contrasting colors and things like of that there in terms of how visible things were, because I felt that looked really nice. And I wanted it to feel like a decently sized city, and in particular that you're in the center of the city. So there's a lot of different buildings that get slotted in, things like of that. And if we actually go and take a look at the scene, I'm going to head over to the player vehicle. So what we can see is these are the different buildings. Here's our vehicle, with headlights and everything moving along. And everything that you see is basically procedurally assembled. So the world is built from these tiles, and the tiles are straight sections or corner sections, essentially. So if I go to the scene view, you can see it's following the path around, so you don't have any control over where it moves, anything like of that. If we zoom further out, you can kind of see it's just going to be ticking along there, cars moving further around. And so I very intentionally, you'll notice all of these sections, so they do spawn in as ones get despawned, so that there's always enough city essentially. But I very intentionally have these dark walls, and you can't actually notice them. So there's these dark walls so that it cuts off sight lines. That helps with things like the occlusion culling and everything. But the other thing that I do is, if we take a look at how the actual road system works. So we're going to take a look at that. So there's a few different parts to it. One is this, and a big part of this that manages the spawning is this roads manager. So its job is to ensure essentially that it's always got sets of ones to actually create. So it has a whole bunch of spawnable items, and we do some initial churning there because there's a couple of Easter egg and non-Easter egg ones that are available, so we keep track of those. This is really just stuff making leader work easier. We do have a bunch of sort of pieces that we spawn, and we place the car essentially in the middle of that initial set of ones that are active, so that it should be completely out of view. Then in terms of when we're picking an element, how it works is we have this tracking of, okay, how many left turns are permitted, how many right turns, how many forward pieces. And every time we turn left, it decrements that and then increments the number of right turns. And we do the opposite for when we turn right. So these two are sort of keeping in balance. And the number of forward pieces, that is always increasing whenever we turn left or right. So if we turn left or right, then we can generate more of them. And when we go straight, then it decrements it. So it has this balance that it's sort of keeping between the type of thing that it's trying to spawn. So that will make it alternate between left and right. And if we take a look at the sort of setup there, the number of pieces ahead, behind, that's just sort of from a visual point of view. But if we take a look at the number of left turns and right turns permitted, those only start at 1. So what that does is that prevents us from hitting into a situation where it can double back on itself. So it's not going to be able to turn across an existing path, so we can guarantee that we will never actually get any clipping. Because, okay, the number of left turns permitted and right turns both start at 1. When we go and turn left, so we were facing this way, we're now facing over this way, our number of right turns will have increased by actually 1. So we could go and turn right, so back facing forward, and then we could turn right again. So we always are essentially moving forwards, but we might be sort of veering a little bit off to the left or right, but we can never actually turn back on ourselves. And that ensures we never get that clipping. So that was an easy way of actually solving that without having to do anything fancy in terms of logic. So that's a really sort of core sort of element that gets run as a core part of when we're actually selecting the pieces. So our spawning of initial ones, we allow 1 for the vehicle, and we have a set number of ones ahead and behind. When we are doing the actual sort of spawning of pieces, this is sort of the key thing. So what we do is we figure out, okay, well, what are the types of ones that we want to actually try and spawn? So this gives us our candidate sets of ones. We pick sort of the random type of ones that we could actually be spawning from. And then what we can do is those pieces, because they're built on a particular sort of set, we can rotate those. Which that rotation, when I loaded this project up in a slightly newer version of Unity without upgrading Cinemachine, that actually caused a bunch of issues because there was a problem where Cinemachine paths were not actually handling if they were in something that was rotated. It has been fixed in 2.9.7 and later. But that is something to be aware of. If you do run into that with Cinemachine, where you're using a smooth path that you've got embedded in another object, in this case prefabs, and you're rotating that smooth path, if your rotation and things are going awry with that, this is the reason why, and you just need an updated version of Cinemachine, most likely. So a few sort of simple hard-coded things that we've got there for orienting the different pieces. So those are pretty straightforward, fairly familiar things with instantiation. We keep track of what the direction that we're heading in is. That allows us to restrict sort of which ways we, or not restrict, but to actually determine which ways we're actually heading. Because both, a single piece can be used in either direction. And I want to make sure that the driving happens on a consistent side. So when you use a piece, you need to know whether you are actually using it in sort of its forwards or backwards orientation so that you can actually select the right path. So we have some specific stuff for the Easter eggs. The main Easter egg that's in there is that at times the telephone boxes can be replaced with a voxel-based version of the TARDIS that I built. So that's why this particular date is for the anniversary of the initial showing of Doctor Who. I might be a little bit of a fan. And it was kind of a fun Easter egg to throw in. So you will occasionally see the TARDIS in there, and on the Easter egg date, it makes it, I believe, more likely. So it has a significantly higher chance on that date. So that just helps for sort of spawning in when we're getting the particular type of building. So we do have a bunch of different building types. Now, what those building prefabs look like, if we go and take a look. So I built all of these things in Magica Voxel. So our road pieces look like this, and if I turn this so we're in unlit mode, so this is what the prefab for a road piece looks like. And you'll notice a bunch of different things here. Firstly, there's a lot of these spawn points, and I intentionally marked out the center point of each of these. That was actually one of the biggest things that was running into, was making sure everything was properly aligned. So there are spawn points for large buildings, there are ones for medium and sort of small ones. And if we take a look at the different ones, we've got all of our large, we've got our medium ones. And so these actually have tagging on them. So we have our building spawn point, and lots of different ones there. Our lampposts don't have a specific marker, but we can spawn different lampposts. The idea there was having these dedicated spawn points would make it easy for me, spawning in that, for filtering in and out different things. Miscellaneous ones allows us to spawn in bins, stuff like of that, so they would all spawn at specific dedicated locations. And I just had walls for blocking the sight lines. And then there were the Cinemachine tracks. So these, again, I tried to lay these out so that the movement felt fairly natural for when it's going around corners, everything like of that. And all it is just a dolly cart moving along a track. That's all it does. And so we've got one track that's heading that way, and then we have another one heading the other way. So we can select between them. And then we have the different buildings that can be swapped in. And again, these are just straightforward ones in terms of built-in Magica Voxel. They have specific sort of materials on them to really give that nice lighting and glow from them. We have different various models that can be swapped in. So the TARDIS one is meant to be swapped in place of the phone booths. It'll look very bright there. It's kind of over brightening it because it doesn't have the post-processing. But that worked really well with these roads. And so if we take a look again at the actual sort of scene view and head over to any of these sections, and we head on down. So what it would mean is we'd always get the lights. Those were pretty much a guaranteed spawn, but things like the phone booths weren't a guaranteed spawn. Things like the buildings, it had different ones that it could swap in. It had decorative things like of this as well, so I built a few things that were just intended as decoration. And everything that I placed in very intentionally had these illuminated sections of it. I wanted quite specifically to have a lot of bright lights, because those added then a softness to the scene, which I really liked. So every single building that can be in there has some version of that. Even things like tunnels, we have quite bright lights on the actual car itself. And that's a case where we have some of the bins appearing. So you don't see the bins everywhere. They are kind of just fully random in terms of where they're placed. And so that layout worked quite nicely. So you never actually see the horizon. Again, intentional. But then we have the car itself. So this is one where we've got an existing car model. I then have this particle system for doing the rain. That's similar to what I've shown in other tutorials there. So it's a fairly straightforward one. So the camera just sits in there, is able to be turned around, but is still oriented within the vehicle itself. So it's still anchored there. There is, the driver there in the actual front. We've got a couple of emitters. Again, sound, I made a point of the sound emitters are actually at very specific locations. They're at sort of where you would reasonably expect them, so that you will actually hear the sounds coming from where you would expect them to. Because again, that just sort of adds to, it's supposed to be a very chill vibe. You're just listening and interacting with this conversation. Now, in terms of with the car itself, there wasn't really a lot that it needed to do that was clever, especially like the player camera is very straightforward. There's just a little bit of rotation that's happening there. The car itself, there's a little bit of stuff in terms of feeding through speed to the audio system so that that can adjust the actual engine noise that's being made. We have it that it will accelerate and decelerate, so it knows whether it's sort of starting and stopping, and that just sort of, again, modifies the speed, and that, again, feeds into the audio system. We do have specific stuff there for the engine wipers, all of that. And then the position, we just update the position of the cart based upon our speed. We use the actual distance there, works best for this. We check if we've reached the end of a path, and that's how we know we've reached the end of a segment, so we can spawn in new ones. And our things like our lots of hookup for the door and buckle and everything. But most of the logic then is just then taking, okay, well, however the cart's rotated, that's how the vehicle is. And that's also exactly how it's positioned. So that works quite nicely. So the other thing that it's doing here is I'm looking at how we would be rotating. And I'm getting things like our current sort of steering wheel angle. And the reason I do that is I then use that to update the rotation of the actual wheels themselves. So all of the wheel objects get updated based upon how the steering wheel is currently angled. We do get a bit of a sense of sort of the steepness of the turn. That, in terms of how we actually make use of that, if we take a look at where we've got that, that is tied into our speed. So steeper turns, we slow down. If it's not turning, then we're able to go faster. So trying to keep everything with this sort of linked together so that all of the different elements in terms of how the car's moving is feeling right. And that's probably one of the parts that took a lot of iteration, was getting that feeling of the car moving in a reasonable, logical way, and having that feel correct. That was sort of a big, big part of it. So that's sort of what was happening with the car movement. Things like the weather side of stuff, because we do have the rain around us. The rain is just a particle system using VFX graph. There's nothing too complicated to it. The conversation system is one of the main parts, though, because conversation system is a big part of what's happening. So it's built around these tails. So the tails are XML files. And what they look like, for example, is this. So they're an XML file. They have these different lines. So there is the text for a line. And this is, I was using some modified versions of the fungus visual scripting package. So this is here. That means wait for 2 seconds before actually saying that. So you'll see different markup like that. And the responses, the coding I went for those was that essentially you had a positive, a negative, and just staying silent. And so there wasn't actually text to your particular responses. It was more just you essentially being tired and being like a or a or just completely zoning out and staying silent. And so depending upon what you chose, that would actually change how the driver would respond. So that was sort of a key part of the structure for it. And so it just had all of these different lines and responses, and it had different markup that could be added in there. I also, for these, could indicate which thing was the default. Generally, the silent one was always going to be the default, but that actually was something that I built into this. So those XML files got loaded in to these tail objects. So you'll see a bunch of attribute markups here. These are so that I can directly load that XML file and have it populate not just this structure, but then also populating these different lines and these responses and everything. So having this markup with the XML attributes, indicating things like the sort of extra stuff where it was grabbing the responses, all of that made it really, really easy to load in this complex data. I didn't need to do any custom parsing. I just had to make sure that I followed the consistent structure. Now, in terms of then how this actually worked, so our system here, this is sort of the main controller logic for that text that's actually appearing. So the conversations, I actually had them in the streaming assets folder. And the reason being was that I wanted to make it very easy to add in additional ones later if need be. So I didn't want to have them as a direct asset. So streaming assets worked well. So this is something where you could actually go and modify the conversations in the actual game yourself. So it would go and look for the particular sort of keys and everything. That was how it decided the particular ones. We could keep track of whether there was a story in progress. So that was sort of straightforward, and that would go and actually, again, populate information. We'd keep track of stuff in player prefs for if a key had been completed, so it would try and be finding something that hadn't. Now, if we had gone and completed everything, it would just clear all of the played ones. So the idea was, if you ran this, you would actually each time experience a different conversation until you have experienced all of them. So there was sort of a narrative within each conversation, and then a larger sort of narrative that is being told as a whole. So it just worked with registering tails. I had a couple of debug things for being able to just easily force a particular tail. Rain intensity I could mess with as well. That was just sort of a handy thing. My usual stuff that I often have for making it very easy to grab screenshots. Random thunder generation as well. Always sort of handy. This is all that was needed to load those XML files into these classes. Because with the various little bits of markup there and following the right pattern, ridiculously simple to actually load in the data. So if you have a lot of complex structured data, that would make sense for it to go into lots of classes in particular. If you've got subclasses, things like that, definitely recommend looking into stuff like this XML serializer. Really handy, worked exceptionally well for this. I was very happy with how it worked. A lot of stuff linking up to audio and for working with the different sort of selection stuff. And that's actually something with then, okay, these responses. Again, we had a bit of stuff for, these are straightforward for just keeping track of what the actual UI was doing, for being able to, turn on and off the mouse so that you could select the options. There was a lot of resizing of stuff to actually, handle the appearance, making sure it was looking correct. So that worked quite nicely. So a lot of that was pretty straightforward. As I mentioned, a lot of this was tying into making use of the fungus visual scripting system. So there was a bunch of things where I was directly interacting with the writer system in that. That allowed me to sort of control what stuff was actually being shown. And if we take a look at sort of the kinds of things we're doing there with that, I was controlling sort of stuff with linking up the audio. That was sort of a necessary one. But it was also, I had control for the typing speed. So one of the things that I did set up with this was I wanted to have UI settings for controlling the typing speed. To make it that if someone needed sort of a slower writing speed, that they could easily slow that down so that they could still actually read the subtitles. Sometimes the subtitles go and things go way too fast and there's no chance to read it, which is no fun. I wanted people to actually be able to read it. Which is why there is also support for using the Open Dyslexic font. Again, I'm making it so that it was more feasible for people being able to read what was actually happening. And that's sort of something that I've been trying to incorporate more and more in games as I'm working on them, is building in more of those options for making the game accessible to more people, because I want more people to be able to play the games. And more people be able to hopefully, enjoy the games, have cool experiences. So finding opportunities like that, and it's straightforward as well. So it's something also where I built in for that. It was part of my plan from the very beginning, and that was a very intentional thing, was making it that I had it there from the beginning so that it was always something I was testing with and making sure it worked. So that sort of could link into the responses, stuff like of that. And as I mentioned, I was using fungus, but I was using it. There was a lot of stuff directly linking into things like the writer system to actually at a lower level than sort of what you would normally do. The reason for that was so that I could get events for actually firing off responses, all of those different ones. It made it a lot easier to actually work with. Did mean that I was having to dive in a bit of a lower level with it, but the end result is have a system, we have a nice display of, okay, how long left till it selects the default. So it always gave a good clear indication of what the default was. And again, this is part of that sort of designing for accessibility. With this, you've got the text, you've got sort of colors, and the colors are really just to differentiate the things that don't correspond to the meaning. But you have multiple ways that you can select stuff. There's a number shown, so you could just press a number for actually selecting it. You can click on it, and we can see, well, this is the default one that's going to be selected. And we can click on it. So you can kind of work with it in either way. And it intentionally also meant that you could sort of have this autoplay essentially. Because if I just do nothing, then and leave this go, I still experience the story. And I have a bit of a time here. So all of that works quite nicely to allow people to experience the story, to know what the defaults are going to be, to give plenty of time to actually respond to stuff. And when you get to the sort of end of it, the vehicle slows down and you hear the person getting out of the car, and then you continue on if you start again with the next tale, and the city will be different every single time. So each time you'll experience it being a little bit different. And depending on the day you're playing on, you might also see, a TARDIS in there. So I was really happy with how all of this sort of worked out. It resulted in something that, a lot of cool and useful bits of tech. That using of XML in the way that I did for being able to import the tails worked quite nicely. That system for being able to support sort of those defaults and these different responses. So I didn't want to write specific responses for sort of the positive and negative responses there. I just kind of wanted it to be a grunt because the person is tired. So that I think worked quite nicely, and I would use that approach in other ones. So that worked quite well. So a lot of different bits and pieces that worked quite nicely for this. The procedural generation as well. You will see sort of repeating ones, but I could very easily add in additional buildings, additional decorations there, enough to make it feel quite different. I could be doing color palette swaps. There's a lot of things that I could add to this if I wanted to add further differentiation. But the city doesn't need to feel super different. It just needs to feel a little bit different and like there's a bit of progression happening there is really sort of the goal. But with this, I have grabbed a bunch of the code for systems like managing the car, in particular things like managing the procedural generation and also the conversation side of this. I'm going to put all of that code available up on GitHub. So it won't be the entire project, and it is going to be referring to some things that I can't share access to just because of licensing. So it's not like you can take the code directly and drop it in a project and it'll work, but it shows you the approaches that I've used for it. So if you're wanting to use any of that, then you'll be able to experiment with that. So dive on in and take a look. Folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code that I mentioned that I've made available from this, that code is available up on GitHub. You can use that code in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. If you've got questions, chuck those in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description as well. But until next time, bye.